Welcome, everybody. My name is Leah Ross, and I'm here tonight to welcome all of you to this very important discussion on climate change, led by Ontario's former Environmental Commissioner, Dr. Dianne Saxe. Tikkun Olam literally means repairing the world in Hebrew, and our talk tonight on climate change couldn't be more relevant.
Dr. Saxe is one of Canada's most respected environmental lawyers, and she was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario from 2015 to 2019. She was appointed unanimously by all MPPs to report to the legislature on Ontario's environmental, energy, and climate performance, and to be the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. During her term, she improved the effectiveness of that bill. She increased public understanding of the urgency of climate change and delivered 17 reports on environment, energy, and climate. Now heading Saxe Law Professional Corporation, she provides legal and strategic inspiration and direction on climate, energy, and the environment. She was selected by Best Lawyers as Toronto's first environmental lawyer of the year and was recognized as one of the world's top 25 environmental lawyers by Best of the Best in 2008. I had the opportunity to hear Dianne speak last spring, and I learned a great deal from her talk. I felt personally motivated to learn more and take action on climate change, including helping to start the Danforth Jewish Circle's Climate Action Team. We invited Dianne to speak to you tonight, trusting that once you hear what she has to say, if you're not already involved, you will feel similarly motivated to be part of the change that is so crucial to our future on this planet. And now over to you, Dianne.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about what I talk about all the time. Climate change is everything, and why it matters to Jews, and what we can learn from COVID. And then there'll be some time for questions at the end. The basics of the climate crisis, I presume everybody knows, but sometimes people find it helpful for me to remind them. What is it that people are doing that is changing the whole climate? And the answer is pretty simple. Throughout the history of the world, the sun has shone, and most of the heat that the solar radiation that lands on the Earth has just bounced off the Earth and gone right back out to outer space. A little bit has been kept in the atmosphere, particularly for the last number of hundreds of millions of years. Carbon dioxide and other gases maintained in part by living creatures have created a balance. So we've been able to keep enough heat on the Earth to keep it warm and comfortable for the evolution of life as we know it, but most of the heat has escaped. What we humans have done, particularly in the last 150 years, and especially in the last 30 years, is by burning fossil fuels, which is where most of the greenhouse gases come from, we've put enough carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, but mostly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere that the windows that the heat used to escape through are narrower. So you think of a bathtub. If the tap is dripping and the same rate the plug is leaking, the water level doesn't change. But if you put some hairs in the drain, and then you put more hairs in the drain, you put more hairs in the drain, and the water can't escape from the bathtub, but the drip keeps coming at the same rate, sooner or later, it's going to overflow. But we're having a little bit of that same experience. Yes, the amount of carbon dioxide we've put in the atmosphere is still pretty small, but the atmosphere is exquisitely sensitive to very tiny concentrations of carbon dioxide, and it's done enough that you can see far less heat has been escaping into outer space, and that means we've been keeping it here on the Earth. Oops, a daisy. So what's happening with all that heat? Well, the simplest way to think about it is that we're giving the world a fever. We're blowing away temperature records all over the world. This is a picture of last June. The dark red you can see is warmest ever records since human records began. And you can see there were a lot of places in the world last June where the warmest records ever. This winter, Russia had record warm, and they now have enormous fires rampaging over the landscape. We have, so GHG is an acronym for greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide. So we have the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions. We have the highest level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have the highest temperatures. We have the highest acidity of the oceans. Carbon dioxide doesn't just stay in the atmosphere. Some of it dissolves into oceans, where it makes the oceans too increasingly acidic, which is very bad for anything that needs to make a shell. So we are changing the entire world as a result of the physics that flow from our extraordinary use of fossil fuels. Now, where is all that heat gone? Now, people tend to assume that what we feel ourselves is all that's really happening, and that's just not right. So most of the heat that has been trapped in all these years of burning fossil fuels, where is it? You can see this chart on the left. Those of you with good eyes or a really good screen, you'll see a tiny line of red at the bottom. Kathy, do you see a tiny line of red at the bottom? Okay, just nod is good. Nod's good. And that tiny line, that's about 1% of the heat is in the atmosphere. That's where we feel it. When we go outside and we say, boy, March or August or January didn't used to feel like this. When we were little, it wasn't like this. Well, you're right, it wasn't like this. But only 1% of the heat is in the air. There's about 3% in soil and vegetation. There's about 3% that's warmed up the ice. But most of it is in the water, and most of that is in the oceans. And this has all happened during my lifetime. So what happens when you warm up water? I hope you learn most of this in grade 3. The first thing is when you warm up air, it takes up more space. Well, it's the same for water. When you warm up water, it takes up more space. What does that do to sea level? It's got to rise. The water takes up more space. The second thing that happens when you heat up water is it doesn't hold as much oxygen. And that's a huge problem for anything in the ocean that needs to breathe. And the third thing that happens when you heat up water, there's a clue on the slide. Storms are heat engines. They get their force from the heat at the surface of the oceans. What's happened to the level of heat at the surface of the oceans? So these heat engines, the storms, they grow faster, they grow more explosive, they grow to higher levels, they become more destructive. And this is all a direct result of the global heating that we as humans are creating. Now, it's not just something that's happened over 250 years. I mean, it's true that there has been some gradually, but most of this is on our watch. So of all the carbon pollution that we humans have ever put into the atmosphere, half of it is in just the last 30 years. How many of you have been adults for at least 30 years? This has happened on our watch. On our watch, we have pushed the climate from stable to unstable for our own short-term convenience, and the consequences will last hundreds and thousands of years. Oops, there we are. So one of the things that I often hear from people, and it's been my experience no matter what the bad news is about a virus or a health issue or a financial issue, whatever it is, a lot of people's reaction is to try to hang on and wait for normal to come back. And I hear that from people about climate, and it simply physically cannot happen. The laws of physics do not care about our opinion. What we normally mean, when we talk about normal, what our laws are designed for, what our insurance is generally designed for, what our crops are designed for, what our infrastructure is designed for, it's roughly the average of the 20th century. And that's the zero line that you can see on this slide. Now, I hope you can see that we don't live anywhere near that zero line anymore. And if you don't remember anything else I'm saying tonight, you need to remember that this is just what's happened already in terms of temperature measured in the Earth. And we know it will get much worse because it takes about a generation between the time that we drive our cars or take an airplane or otherwise put climate pollution into the air and the time that we really experience the effects in these charts. So what you're seeing here is mostly the impact of what had happened by the time my kids were little. And now they're parents of their own. We have locked in at least another ½ degree of warming just from what we've emitted already, not just because of all the fossil using things that we've built. So the old normal is gone. It can't come back. It can't come back in our lifetime or our kids' lifetime or our grandchildren's lifetime. Neither have we reached a new normal. So I hear people talk about the new normal. Well, new normal, okay, let's say you gain 10 pounds and then you think you're now stable, you buy a new pair of pants. That's because you think you've reached a new normal. You're going to be able to stay at that new weight. We have not reached a new normal. We are not anywhere near a new normal. The level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going up faster and faster and faster. Even now, even with all those shutdowns, we're reaching new records. This is already, this is an old slide. We've over 417 now. It's going up faster and faster and faster. You can see how much faster it's going up 2.5 times now as fast as it was even in the 1990s. So I'm from an evidence-based profession. Some of you, I'm sure, are from evidence-based professions. There's a lot to be said about making decisions based on evidence, but there's a big weakness, which is evidence can only come from what's happened before. So I ask you, what happened to people the last time carbon dioxide was this high in the atmosphere? There weren't any people. Nothing that humans depend on developed in a world where carbon dioxide was anywhere near as high as it is now. So we are going into completely uncharted territory, and we're going there faster and faster. It's like being on the deck of the Titanic, seeing the iceberg and going faster directly towards it. Because we've had the science, we've had the basic science of climate change since the mid-1980s. That's why all the countries of the world agreed in 1992 that we were in serious trouble. And we all agreed to work together to keep global heating below 2 degrees, because we knew if we got past 2 degrees, we'd be in real trouble. And instead, all we've done is increase our emissions. Our emissions are up more than 2/3 since that time. As I told you, the accumulated emissions in the atmosphere have doubled since that time. So what does this mean for us? Well, a lot of people say to me, well, okay, so China, India, other people, other places, somebody else ought to do something about this. What does this have to do with us? We're just 37 million people. Well, actually, we're really big polluters. There are nearly 200 countries in the world. And of those nearly 200 countries, you'll be glad to know that Canada is in the top 10 climate polluters in the whole world. In fact, we're #1 at driving the worst, most polluting vehicles in the entire world. We have beaten out every single other country in the world. We are huge per capita emitters, and we are huge emitters as a country as a whole. So we have a big share in causing the problem, and we have an enormous responsibility in doing something about it. In Toronto, we are experiencing some of those impacts in the period of time. So this is showing you a 1.5 centuries of temperature records in Toronto. During that period of time, the world as a whole has warmed by a little over 1 degree centigrade. During that very same period of time, Toronto's already 3 degrees hotter. And that has a lot of consequences, especially for people who have to sleep at night without air conditioning, which tends not to be the rich. We can see it also generally in Canada, we're warming to more than 2 times as fast as the world average. We can see in Ontario what's already happened. Again, this is not what's coming. This is only what's happened already. in the last 4 decades, look how winter has changed. We now have enormously more precipitation in the winter in many parts of Ontario. The darker the blue, the more. And a lot of what used to come as snow now comes as rain. So that's bad news if you like to ski. Fine, I like to ski. It's bad news if you like to grow forests. It's horrible news if, for example, you're a moose. So moose are exquisitely adapted for cold. But if it rains in February and then there's a deep freeze, the moose is in deep trouble. Their coat is soaked and then frozen to the skin. They've lost their insulation and their food now has a layer of ice over it. And not only that, the winters, which used to be cold enough to kill the ticks, which suck their blood, now the winter's not cold enough and there's more and more ticks. And so more and more cows aren't able to bring healthy calves into the world, and so on. There's many, many consequences. More winter floods, lots of other consequences. And this is only what has happened already by 2016. So everything I've talked to you so far is about averages. Averages tell us a lot about the big long-term picture. It's part of how we know that Israel is going to be in big trouble over the longer term because of extra heat and water stress, which are already huge issues in Israel and the Mediterranean region. But in the shorter term, it doesn't tell us very much of the story. So the old joke, which Kathy heard last year, is if your head's in the oven and you have 3rd-degree burns and your feet are in the freezer and you have frostbite, on average, you're fine. But in real life, you've got to go to the hospital right now. It's the extremes that do an awful lot of the damage. So one might ask, how much worse are the extremes already? Now, we don't have really good data going back a century and a half for what the weather extremes were like. So the actuaries, those wild and crazy insurance people, they only went back to 1960. And they said, all right, how do the climate extremes today compare to the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s? Anybody remember those? It's not that long ago. How much worse is it now? There's a clue on the slide. We already have 4 times as many climate extremes now here in Canada, the United States, and we're the luckiest people in the world. And this is only what's happened already. I don't know if you saw on the news, we're now scheduled this year to have the 5th consecutive above average hurricane season this summer during COVID. So we know it's not a question anymore about if we're going to have the impacts of climate extremes. It's a question of when, it's a question of where. These are all pictures from around Ontario, floods, fire, drought, wind, heat, but we know that more of them are coming and more of them are coming in more places. We don't know where, we don't know when, but we know there will be more of them and they will be fiercer and they will be bigger and they will be harder to cope with. Yeah, this is just turning that into money for those of you mathematically inclined. You'll see that the bars are in different colors on this chart. That's because until 2007, the Insurance Bureau of Canada reported all the losses from extreme weather. And you can see that between 1983 and 2007, they started to go up. But they didn't go up all that much. In 2008, the Insurance Bureau changed the way they report these numbers. Since 2008, they only report what they call catastrophic events, which they defined as meaning individual events, each one of which cost them more than $25 million. And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the chart is a much smaller group of storms than you used to see. But even so, look what's happening to the insured losses. Now, does anybody think this might affect the cost of insurance? Does anybody think this might affect the availability of insurance? Do you think this might affect inequality? Who is going to stop paying for insurance? Probably not the rich people. So when a disaster occurs, inequalities are again exacerbated. So the climate crisis is a, oh yes, I'd forgotten I'd put that in here. The climate crisis is a threat multiplier. Whatever you care about most, the climate crisis is going to make it harder to cope with. And yeah, so then there you go. So what's ahead? Well, I mean, nobody has a perfect crystal ball, but we know quite a lot about what's ahead. And we're talking about the lifetime of today's children. Now, most of the time when you see in the media, they talk about fancy reports that come from various experts. They talk about by 2050 this, by 2100 that. As commissioner, I spent a lot of time talking with various politicians, and I can assure you that I never met a politician who really gives a damn about 2100. They know they will not be in power in 2100. Most of them don't expect to be alive in 2100. None of them expect to be in power in 2050. So they're really not engaged. But 2100 sounds far away and it sounds remote, but it's talking about the lifetime of today's children. These are two of the ones I care about. Who are the small people you care about? We're talking about what's going to happen to them and their choices and their world. So who can we go to for the best information about what's coming? Well, sometimes you hear people say, I don't know who to believe. I really don't know who to believe. There's a very clear answer for this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is who you should believe. I told you 3 decades ago, all the countries of the world got together and made a treaty, an international treaty, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which we all agreed to keep global heating below 2 degrees. And the governments of the world said, we need a source of reliable science that we can all depend on. And so they created, I think it's the largest scientific collaboration in human history. We've now had 30 years of thousands of the best scientists in the world working together, and every single thing they write has to be vetted by every country in the world and voted. When they come out with a report, it is not beautifully written, but the facts are rock solid. So what have they told us? So their main job is to put together really big, massive reports. The last one was in 2014. The next one will be in 2022. But they were also asked to write 3 special reports following all of which came out in the last year and a half. And they struck terror into the heart of anyone who was paying attention. So the first one is, how bad is it going to be to get to 2 degrees? If we let global heating go to 2 degrees, are we safe? And many, especially the small island states, have been arguing for some time, 2 degrees is not safe. Many countries will disappear by 2 degrees. And so the IPCC was asked, how much worse will 2 degrees be than, say, if we could stop global heating at 1.5? And in parts of the world, we're already at 1.5. So the answer was a lot. A 2 degree world will be much worse than if we stopped global heating at 1.5. In the wording of the bureaucrats of the committee, large, widespread, robust differences. Huge differences in heavy precipitation, extreme heat, drought, sea level. But most critically, if we stopped global heating at 1.5 degrees, then we can expect that most human and natural systems will be able to adapt. There'll be costs and losses, but by and large, natural systems will adapt, human systems will adapt. If we get to 2 degrees, by that point, many human and natural systems will have failed. They will not be able to adapt. So that means a world that is much less safe for that small person you care about. What about food? We know that there is an intimate connection between climate and weather, heat, wind, water, and food. So how is the climate crisis affecting food? So the second report, which came out last August, said the climate crisis is already adversely affecting food quality and security. We face high risks if we let global heating go to 1.5 degrees. We face very high risks if we let it go to 2 degrees. And if we keep delaying action, dragging our feet as many governments are, this is what we can expect. A less stable, more expensive food supply, also lower food quality in many respects, rapid declines in agricultural productivity, especially in hotter countries, irreversible damage to land and ecosystems, more wildfire, more conflict, and more people on the move because they cannot feed their families where they are. When you read about the Central Americans besieging the American southern border, you should think climate change. There are hundreds of millions of people who are facing drought and inability to feed their family because it's hotter, it's drier than it was before. So that leaves, the third report, which came out last September in the fall, on oceans and what's called the cryosphere, which is everything frozen. And the answer was, everything frozen is melting faster and faster and faster than seemed possible, even in the assessment report of 2014. The oceans are in crisis. They are having their marine heat waves. There's the acidification. Coral reefs are dying. The Great Barrier Reef has just had another enormous bleaching. Faster rising sea levels are threatening coastal cities. By the way, there's a large number of nuclear plants built near sea level, including one in Canada. Soaring flood damage, dire water shortages, and we can expect hundreds of millions of people to be facing regular floods within the next 3 decades. In fact, for a very significant number of those people, their homes will be underwater at high tide. Do you think they will stay there? I wouldn't. And if you think about the political consequences that we've seen around the world of having 1 million Syrians on the move, imagine what the political consequences will be when there are hundreds of millions of people on the move. And even I can't be sure to die on time before that happens. I used to think this was a problem for my grandchildren. It's coming faster than that. It's not just that. So in addition to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there is a similar scientific body dealing with everything that lives other than us. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, basically the natural systems on which our lives depend and everything else with which we share the planet. So they also came out with a massive report last year, and they said, we're in deep trouble. We are in deep, deep trouble. The natural systems on which our lives depend and every other living creature, there's already 1 million species at risk because of the climate crisis. And we are pushing them towards collapse. World Health Organization, climate change, one of the biggest global health threats of this century, and they estimate that the health benefits far outweigh, probably double the costs of meeting our climate change goals. In other words, any dollar that we spend on reducing our fossil fuel use probably save us $2 in health damage and health costs. Again, during the lifetime of today's children. We have the Council of Canadian Academies did a report last year on Canada's top climate change risks. Their estimate was that there's an 85% risk of catastrophic damage to physical infrastructure in Canada in just the next 20 years. And what do they mean by catastrophic? They defined it as billions of dollars worth. And then, of course, things will get much worse. Insurance Bureau has told us that, in their view, up to 10%, well, they told me 10% of Canadian properties may soon be too high risk for private sector flood insurance if no protective measures are made. There's a lot of people who can't get flood insurance. And that's not just dealing with what are we going to have to do to adapt. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Insurance Bureau put out a report last year. They estimated that municipal governments already need $5.3 billion every single year just to adapt to the climate changes that are occurring already and to repair the damages that are occurring already. And nobody wants to pay for that. I mean, the federal government, to give them credit, has put up this $2 billion, but when the need is already over $5.3 billion a year, and this is a multi-year fund of which is supposed to eventually get to $2 billion, you can see that there's an enormous shortfall. And we're just at the beginning, right? We're just at the beginning. The climate crisis is only going to get bigger from here. Nobody has wanted to get serious about what this will cost us if we continue to do what we're doing. And what else? Well, it is reasonable to expect that the impacts of climate change will be large, they'll be uneven, that will destabilize existing institutional arrangements, increase incentives to violently redistribute wealth, or generate other forms of social conflict. So is it too late? Well, I have to say, too late for what? Is it too late to avoid our children having a very different world than we had? Yes, it's too late for that. We threw that away. We had 30 years notice and we threw it away. But it's not too late to make a difference in what's coming. We're in a really crucial decade right now. There's a small handful of years left to make a big difference in what's ahead. So our choices right now really matter. If we want a 2-degree world, which we know is much less stable and safe than today, but still survivable for most, well, cutting our climate pollution, cutting our use of fossil fuels 5% every year doesn't get us there. Even if the whole world did it. We've got to go faster than that if we want to stay under 2 degrees. And if we want 1.5 degrees, which is a world that's less stable and safe than today, but still manageable, probably still has coffee and mangoes and doesn't have hundreds of millions of people on the move. Well, I mean, when I did this chart, it was a 6% straight line reduction. That's too late for that. Now we've got to cut our emissions in half this decade. In half. We have to be using at least 1/2 less of everything fossil fuel that we're using today. Really challenging. Technically, a lot of that's manageable, but we have to be working on it now. It has to be the most important thing that we do, because it is. Now, I do think it's particularly important for Jews. One of the reasons is you've already seen why the climate crisis is going to mean times of conflict, times of loss, times of migration. That has historically not been good for Jews. And I don't think it would be this time either. A lot of Jews in North America have higher incomes than average, and that usually higher incomes almost always equivalent to higher climate impact. It also means more opportunity to do something about it. And the third thing is, anybody who cares about Israel, what's ahead for the land of Israel is truly frightening. And then there is Tikkun Olam. For anyone who takes religious obligations seriously, we have an obligation to look after the world. We have agency, therefore we have accountability, especially those with privilege and power. And really, any of us, compared to most of the world, have privilege and power. And we have this famous quote, "See to it you do not destroy my world. There is no one to repair it after you." Well, this has never been more true than right now. If you're interested in more specifically Jewish thoughts about how to approach climate change, there's a wonderful zine called Living Underwater. It's available online. If you can't find it, Kathy, I can give you the link, but I think you can just Google it. And it does include an article of mine, but some beautiful art and poetry and many thoughts about bringing Jewish wisdom to this question of what do we do now? So can we learn something from COVID? This is a cartoon that was in The Economist a week or so ago. And as I hope you can see, well, okay, right now we're having a battle with COVID. Okay, great. That's something we probably, I mean, it's going to be a big battle, but probably can manage it. But look who's waiting. Look what's next. It's probably, the climate crisis is actually quite a bit larger, but it wouldn't have fit on the drawing. What can we learn from COVID? Well, there's lots of things. In fact, this is now a whole area of study and journalism around the world on climate and COVID. If you're interested, for example, GRIST has a newsletter specifically on climate and COVID. But there's a number of lessons. One of them is exponential growth looks slow for a while. Do you remember how slowly this virus was moving in December and January and February and even the beginning of March? This drawing is a little out of date, but you can see even the beginning of March, it just did not seem to be very big. It didn't seem to be growing very fast. Well, that's because people do have a very poor intuitive knowledge, understanding of exponential growth. It looks slow for a while, but then the turbojet is on. And surely we've learned from COVID. Everybody's seen this drawing in terms of the hospital capacity. It's exactly the same in terms of the Earth's carrying capacity. Our way of life is fragile. Physics, like viruses, do not compromise, and exponential growth equals disaster, and we are right now on the track for exponential growth. What we take for granted, what isn't measured in money, but so much of what we most need isn't measured in money. Hazel Henderson did this drawing in 1982, trying to get across to people. We pay so much attention to the private sector. We pay so much attention to what's measured in money, but look what it depends on. The private sector depends on the public sector. Both of them depend on the underground economy. All of that depends on the love economy, what people do for each other, the care that parents give children, everything that you do in your synagogue, everything we do for each other without pay. And all of that depends on nature. And we cannot have a healthy economy if we trash the things it depends on. The poor and the vulnerable do suffer the most, but no one nowhere is going to be immune. So let us learn, listen to the scientists. We've seen a concerted attack on expertise and on science for the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years with certain of our current political leaders. This is really dangerous. The scientists actually know things we don't know. We need to take early action. Early action works better and costs less. Late action will be very painful and very destructive. We've learned this from COVID. It's exactly the same for the climate crisis. And just as compromised immune systems make people much more vulnerable, just as air pollution makes people much more likely to die from COVID, it's the same with compromised ecosystems. The more impaired they are, the more likely they are to collapse, the more likely we are to collapse with them. We can still change our habits and choose life. We are doing that. That's why we're all in our garages or whatever, and not in a room together, which I would like very much. We can choose our habits and choose life, which is a Jewish obligation. So what can we do? The first thing we have to do is to take seriously that the top environmental problem is apathy, selfishness, greed, and apathy, people's unwillingness to take responsibility and change. That's not something lawyers can fix. It's not really even something that governments can fix. But it is something that religious tradition should help us with. Religious traditions are a place specifically to talk about obligation and morality and what's right and wrong and how we work together to make a better world. That's what religious communities are for. We can still make a lot of things better. There's so many things that could be better in a community where we have clean, compact, connected communities, where we use far less fossil fuels, where the air is cleaner. We're getting a tiny taste of what it's like in a community where the air is cleaner and there are fewer cars and you can actually hear the birds and people walk around and see their neighbors and have time to talk to each other. There are many losses and horrors right now. Somebody they know, her father's dying today. But there's also wonderful things right now that are worth saving and fighting for. We can still make many things better. So what can we do? Things I ask everyone at every level to do. First of all, we have to reduce our personal carbon footprints. This is by no means the whole answer, but it's a piece of the answer. And we need to be cutting it in half this decade, which means we need to be cutting it about 7.5% a year because we've waited so long. We need to get ready to adapt to the crazy weather that's coming. Certainly if you have a basement, you should be thinking about flooding. Everybody needs to be thinking about how we're going to be prepared to be self-sufficient when the power goes out and there's more and more disruptions coming. But the single most important thing we have to do is this un-Canadian thing of speaking up. Because what we most need is collective action. Oh, that's another slide in a second. And collective action doesn't happen unless people speak up. Now, what about individual action? People often want to ask me, what can I do that matters the most? What you see on the right, the very last report I got out of my office the day before it was dissolved, was this one about the individual carbon footprints of Ontarians. For people in Ontario, the average person, half of our direct climate footprint comes from just 4 things. Driving those vehicles, I said the most inefficient climate polluting cars in the world, heating leaky houses, flying, and eating beef. Another way of looking at it is think, because my report didn't look at investment. Transport, how you get around. Housing, how much energy we use in our homes. Investment, what you do with your money, enormously important and tends to be overlooked. Nutrition, what you eat. And consumption, just how much other stuff we buy. So if you want lots of details about that, all my Environmental Commission reports are available on my website, which is saxefast.com. I reposted them there because the government broke all the links. So they're all there. But individual action at most is maybe a quarter, a third of the answer. What really matters is collective action. And that's the job of governments. And governments don't act unless they hear from their constituents. Every politician that I met as commissioner told me the same thing. The most powerful thing any politician can say to their colleagues is, my constituents say. And usually what they hear from the constituents is some version of what's in it for me. They don't hear about the environment. They don't hear about climate. They don't hear about children. So it's really important that we speak up on these issues. And people who speak English are well-read, educated. It's particularly our obligation. So how do we speak up? Well, Ed Maybach developed these magic 11 words that I'm asking you to memorize. Say them with me. Simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. One more time, I can't hear you. Simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. That's how we get messages across. And each of you is a trusted voice for some people. People who love you, people who like you, people who respect you, people who you work with, people who maybe you pray with. And you can help other people become trusted voices as well, including young people. So this is, it looks scary. It's actually not that hard. And there's a number of resources for learning how to speak about climate. For example, Climate Fast has classes on how to have a carbon conversation. They'd be glad to include people. 3 critical areas to speak up about. We have to have a price on climate pollution. If pollution is free, we get more of it. Basic economics. The Nobel Prize for Economics, right after Ontario's Conservative government, the Ford government, trashed our climate law and our climate price, the Nobel Prize was given to William Nordhaus for proving that it is the single cheapest, most effective way of giving us a green future. Second thing is to stop sprawl. Urban sprawl is the largest driver of Ontario's climate pollution, as well as various other kinds of environmental destruction, and we have to protect nature. Now, there is, in fact, an opportunity right now. I am sure that each of you would like to do something right now that could really make a difference, right? Would you like to do something right now that can really make a difference? Okay, good. So, right now, as you've probably noticed, the federal and provincial governments are spending a boatload of your money, right? We're expecting the federal deficit this year to be, what, $250 billion or something, which is all money that probably our kids are going to have to pay back. So it really, really matters whether that money is used to build back the dirty industries of the past, which will lock us into a brown recovery and a dirty future and really giving up on the window to deal with climate action, or we could have a green recovery where we're building towards the green economy that we need, that would create more jobs and better lives and cleaner air, more health, better chances. And that was one of the things also that the IPCC really emphasized in their reports, especially the Land and Food Report. If we get serious now, we can not just keep from sliding into the abyss, we can actually make a lot of things better. There is still time to restore ecosystems, to restore soil, to restore forests, to make a lot of things better. So right now, the federal cabinet is bitterly divided on whether to shovel the money to the powerful, rich people of the past who are, let me tell you, sparing no effort to lobby for their billions of dollars, or should we be building towards a greener future? So there are occasionally critical windows. You know how there are critical windows when children are growing? Well, there are critical windows in the political world where decisions are being made, where what people say really matters, and we're at that right this minute. So you could write your own plan for green recovery. Feel free, if you got that in you, go for it, but you might find it easier and faster to endorse one that already exists. And as it happens, I spent a lot of the last month working with two groups who've developed really good plans, not perfect, but really good plans for a green recovery. And it would be tremendously helpful for you to endorse at least one of these letters, forward it to your MP and to the Prime Minister's office, and encourage others to do so. And you've got two choices, at least two choices. One of them is by the Clean 50, which is a group, this is companies, this is clean capitalism. This is companies with building things in the private sector that help build a green future. So they have a letter about what clean companies need to be sustained through this and to be able to expand. And the Climate Caucus is a fabulous group of mayors and councillors from municipalities right across the country. And they put together a letter focusing on what municipalities can do and what can happen in communities, and again, what kind of help from the federal government will make this possible. If you are or know any elected municipal representatives anywhere in Canada, if they haven't signed the Climate Caucus letter yet, please encourage them to do so. And again, there's a separate section at the bottom where other people can sign on as supporters of the Climate Caucus, but absolutely endorse the letters, forward them to your MPs. What we've heard back from several of the cabinet ministers who care about this is hearing from the public on this right now, really important, really important, really important. If you don't do anything else this week, please send at least one of these letters. You can get them on their websites. It might be easier to find them on my website, on the blog. If you go to April 23rd and 24th, you'll see the links to each of these letters. And Kathy, if you have any trouble, I can send you the links and you can circulate them. Right, so there you go. So who would like to have some hope here? I mean, I would. Well, this is the only formula I know for hope. It's the only one I know that works, is to start with knowledge. That means we have to look the facts in the face, even though they are utterly terrifying. But if we just stop there and we end up in despair, we do nothing, then there's no hope. The hope comes from joining with other people to take concrete, meaningful action. And the good news is there's an enormous number of important things to do. And we can all do some of them. Nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something, and every single one of you can send letters. It's a really easy place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dianne. That was very sobering news, and a lot to take in. But there's certainly opportunities for positive action. I would like to invite people now, if you've got questions, to put them in the chat. And we do have some time for Q&A. We talked about the need for governments to take action and for us to push governments to take the appropriate action. I wonder if you could, and you did give us three main categories around that, could you elaborate a little bit on what the priorities should be for governments in Canada? What should they be looking at now to transition to a green economy?
Well, we do try to set some of that out in the letters. Every decision now has to have a climate lens, every single decision. We all, on everything we do, everything we buy, everything we build, every permit we give, every law we pass, we're in an emergency, right? Our house is on fire. And so if it is making the green transition easier, faster, cheaper, participation broader, more equal in the green transition, then it's doing the right thing. If it's building, permitting more fossil fuel use, it's the wrong thing. And so that, should we be building any more suburbs? No, clearly no, absolutely not. Should we be building any more natural gas infrastructure? No, absolutely not. Should we be turning road space over to cycling and walking spaces so that there's more safe place for people to get around without fossil fuels? Absolutely. Should there be more places to plug in an electric bicycle or an electric car? Yes, absolutely. Should we be launching, well, here's an example. It's very important to preserve jobs. So there are really expensive, polluting ways to create a few jobs, or there are much less expensive, much less polluting ways to create more jobs. Which one is better? Well, that's actually, you'll see if you look at the editorial I did in the National Observer last week, Professor Eric Miller has done some really good research that for $1 million of output, you get 2.7 jobs in the oil patch. You get 10 jobs if you spend that same money renovating houses and making them more energy efficient. And then they're cheaper to live in, they're more comfortable to live in, they have better resale values, the air quality is better. So which one is better? Clearly it's better if we're handing out money to hand it out for something that creates more jobs that will be here and that gives us a way to a future. So there's a long, long list of things that can work. But the three simplest ones, we have to price carbon, we have to stop sprawl, we've got to protect and restore nature instead of turning, yet another field and a forest and wetland into a parking lot. We can't afford to lose them anymore. We need all those places.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question here from Ms. Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition. She says, my organization is worried about the timing to ask for our action to continue as the governments have COVID 24 hours a day on their minds. And I think you are saying, do it now and always.
So the timing is right now because although governments have COVID on the mind, they're also making very big long-term decisions. They're spending an enormous amount of future money. And they're right now, while things are broken, is exactly when there's an opportunity to reshuffle the pieces. So we desperately need, for example, and for a really simple example, we need bike lanes. We need an enormous number of bike lanes. There is a huge unmet need for safe places for people to cycle. And there's been proof over and over around the world that if you give people safe places to cycle, you get lots and lots of people cycling who used to be driving. So right now, when there are comparatively few cars on the road, it's an easier time than we ever had before to turn parking and curb lanes into cycle space, which Toronto is refusing to do, but many cities around the world are doing. So right now, when decisions are being made about the future, it is precisely essential to talk about climate. This is the moment when the choices we make now will determine the future. People say, oh, well, we'll just deal with COVID now. When that's all over, we'll get back to this climate stuff. Honestly, I've heard that very same excuse for 40 years, and it's never worked. There is always an emergency. Every senior civil servant and politician I have known in my entire career has always had a desk full of emergencies. And there will always be. And as we go ahead, there's going to be more and more of them. Right now is the moment. And we also, partly because it's shattered, partly because money is being spent, partly because we have people's attention and some awareness that expertise matters, and partly because, remember, it costs less if you do it early, just the same as for COVID. Do it now.
Okay, from Susan, there's so much great technology out there that I see on the internet and on special programs. Why are these not being used in the current economy? We have 300,000 people coming to Canada every year. They're all looking for a place to live. How do we do that and not have urban sprawl? Tall condos with no gardens, no place to compost. We know what is better, but how do we accommodate all these people?
Right. Yes, there's lots of great technology. In terms of that question, if you're interested, so the second last report I put out, also the very last week before my office was closed, Chapter 4 is exactly on the question of sprawl. But the short answer is not condo towers. It's called the missing middle. 3 to 6 stories, and we have an enormous amount of wasted space in existing serviced areas that that isn't being well used and could be beautiful places to live. We do have the technology, and there are complex economic and political reasons why we make it difficult and expensive to build mid-rise housing, and so developers build high-rise because if they have to fight for years to get approvals, they can make more money building high-rises. But yes, there absolutely is an alternative, and if the province and the municipality change the rules to make that as of right, we'd have a lot more of it. It should also be built out of wood. We should have, you've heard of plant-based diets, we need plant-based buildings, and they can be quicker to build, much healthier to live in, much more fun to live in, and they sequester carbon. And besides, they provide jobs for Canadian forestry communities. We've got lots of things that can work. By the way, I forgot to mention this before. For those of you who are interested in solutions and what's being done about them, I have a new podcast called Green Economy Heroes, where I'm interviewing business leaders who are doing exactly this, developing solutions. Green Economy Heroes, you can get it anywhere you get your podcast.
Okay, great. Here's a question that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds from Diana. How do we actually deal with rich, powerful lobbyists who represent environmentally damaging industries? Are there actions that government can take to provide incentives or take other action to address that?
There's a huge number of things that government can do. I laid out a number of them in my climate reports every year. There's no shortage of ideas, but you're right, there is an enormous problem with lobbyists. Canadian Environmental Defense showed that the oil and gas lobby has lobbied the federal government. I think the answer was on average 4 times a day for the last 7 years. And they've been in there, I think, 7 times a day in the last month or so, lobbying not just for tens of billions of dollars, but also to ravage our environmental laws, much as Trump is doing in the US. And we're seeing some of that with the Ford government as well. How do you overcome that? Well, the only way to overcome it is good old-fashioned political organizing. You got to speak up. You got to. The politicians make decisions based on what they're hearing. There's a book called Kochland, Kochland, that documents how the Koch brothers, whom I'm embarrassed to acknowledge, have used their immense wealth and power to buy politicians' decisions that benefit their fossil fuel interests. And they've been very, very successful. But they do it by bombarding politicians with calls and texts and faxes at key moments. They make sure they hear from people that those people trust. They make sure they get donations from people who are prepared to promise more donations if appropriate decisions are made. The only way to overcome that is you and your brother and your mother's bowling team and your kid's soccer group have to be talking to the politicians and writing to them, and with whatever you have to reach out. So one teacher that I met, he got his grade 3 class to send, and each of them sent a Valentine to a municipal councillor to thank him for protecting something or other. I don't know what the context was. But I met that councillor 2 years later. He was still talking about the fact that he got a Valentine from these kids. And one of the reasons that matters stuck so much is when people go to talk to politicians, what do you suppose they say to them? They complain. When people go to talk to a politician, they're asking for something or they're complaining about something. How often do people go to a politician and thank them? Yeah. Even if it's someone who's doing exactly what you want them to do, or close, no, maybe not exactly, but is doing a lot of good things. So if you get someone like Mike Layton or Gord Perks or Catherine McKenna, have you ever thanked them?
Right. Good point.
Right? I mean, thank people when they do the right thing. Write them and tell them what you care about. And so then the key questions for any politician, if you do get to speak to them, is what are you doing on the climate crisis? What else could you do? What's getting in your way? How can we help?
Okay.
And there are probably things you could do.
Yeah. Okay. Here's an interesting one from Josh. What would you say to someone whose life and livelihood is highly dependent on oil and gas and views talk of human-caused climate change as a threat to their identity and livelihood?
So I would, if I could, not be the one speaking to those people. I would have someone like Iron and Earth, or there are a number of groups. So for example, I just read an interview with the head of a drilling company, an oil field service company in Alberta, who has made their entire living out of the oil patch. And he's been sending his roughnecks for retraining as geothermal drillers because he recognizes what he's been doing is the past. And he wants to have a future, and he wants to be part of that future. And perhaps his kids are asking him things at the dining room table. Dan Balaban, who I'll be interviewing on my podcast, he made his living selling software to the oil and gas industry. Now he's one of the biggest developers of solar and wind in Western Canada, and just brought in, gosh, I can't remember, $250 million for a new giant solar development because he recognizes that's the future. So it's not, I'm not a trusted voice for some of the people in the oil patch, but there are people there who are. And those are the ones that I would encourage them to talk to.
Okay. Susan is asking, I understand that plastic, a byproduct of the oil industry, is a larger problem than even car fuel. How do we get rid of all the plastic things being made?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. It doesn't match the data that I've seen. It might depend sort of where and when and how you count and what assumptions you make. But, and I will also say that a lot of plastics are really important. So some parts of the green transition will depend on some uses of plastic. So I would certainly not say I'm against all plastics. Single-use plastics, for sure we should get rid of. And the Oceans campaign has been very effective. Again, that's been sidetracked to some extent by COVID. But, and COVID makes it harder because of the concern about infected surfaces. So a lot of places that were allowing reused things are now gone back to single-use plastic, at least for the moment, while we figure out what to do. But yes, certainly in your own life, single-use plastic is something to get rid of. Let me give a plug to the beeswax companies, Abigo and Bee Bags and others. So we used to use plastic to wrap food in my house. We haven't done that. These beeswax wraps are so much better. The food lasts longer. They smell nice. They're easy to use. They make our lives better. And they're women-run businesses. So those are good things to support. You can even make it yourself if you want. But yes, there isn't, I think, a key moment to action on plastics right now, but there will be as we get back to whatever comes later in our experience with COVID. I don't like to talk about post-COVID because it sort of imagines that it's all going to magically be over and not come back. And I don't think there's been any virus in history that's done that. But in any event, there will be a moment to deal with plastic, but in your own life, it's easy and there's so many better alternatives. I mean, you can see I've dropped my mug quite a few times. Well, I don't know if you can see, but I'm carrying a steel mug that I have dropped many, many, many times. It's fallen off bicycles, it's fallen out of canoes, it's fallen all kinds of places. But I haven't bought or used or accepted a plastic bottle in many years. They were just completely unnecessary.
Okay. Question here from Heather. How do you handle the difference in provincial attitudes towards oil and gas?
So I will say that people's attitudes naturally are affected by their economics. If you make money from the oil and gas business, then you're not likely to want to think that it's bad, or hear anything about that. And yet we do see, even in the prairie provinces, the majority of people understand that we're in a climate crisis and that we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And it's interesting, women perceive the risk more than men, which may be why countries run by women take better climate action, companies run by women take better climate action. having women on the board improves climate action. Everywhere, and you know, look what's happening in Alberta right now. They've got the floods, they've got you know, terrible threats on a number of fronts, and at the same time, the price has fallen. The bottom has fallen out of the oil market because increasingly you don't need oil. Electric cars are getting better so quickly. Renewable energy is now the cheapest way of providing power in many parts of the world. That the oil and gas industry told everybody that they were going to be a money pump for decades to come because everyone's going to need their product. And increasingly, it's clear that that's not true. Investing in coal has been a way to lose a lot of money. Investing in oil is increasingly a way to lose a lot of money. And I think we will see that people's faith in oil and gas and defense in oil and gas is going to wither, and if oil and gas continues to prove to be a way to lose money, not make it.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Here's one from Ron on the energy question. For provinces that do not have sufficient hydropower resources, do you support the use of more nuclear power?
So I wrote an interesting report on nuclear. I am not necessarily opposed to nuclear power. Ontario is spending a boatload of money refurbishing our nuclear plants to run for another few decades. However, it is increasingly clear that nuclear is more expensive. Even if you leave aside, what do we do with the waste? I mean, if you think about what we owe to future generations, creating waste that's going to be extremely hazardous to human life for 100,000 years for our short-term convenience is not a good deal. The kind of nuclear reactors, let me rephrase this, in theory, pebble bed thorium reactors could consume nuclear waste not to produce it. And so there are, in principle, ways of having nuclear energy that would be much cleaner and safer, but they're not the ones we're building right now. So the real force of that argument, I heard Michael Schellenberger, he's very well spoken, but I think he's increasingly out of date. That renewable energy is increasingly able to provide the needs that we have. And the key question, one of the key questions that's been argued is, well, but yes, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, even geothermal can't produce enough. So none of this new renewable stuff really matters until we have storage. Well, storage or big grids, but now we have an increasingly really robust method of large storage invented in Canada, the HydroStore. And so increasingly nuclear is just going to be too expensive, even if you don't worry, which I do, about the accidents and the waste.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Juliet is asking, is there a Jewish fossil fuel divestment movement we can join as a community?
That's a really good question. I don't know. There is a Jewish climate action group in the United States, mm-hmm. and Marilyn probably would know, mm-hmm. but I don't know if they're online. But if there isn't one, please start one, because it's high time. We absolutely should have it. It's just immoral now.
Yeah, I think,
and it's probably really poor investment strategy.
The U.S. group I think you're referring to is called the Jewish Climate Action Network.
That sounds right.
Interesting website if people want to go and take a look at that. From Robert, there's a question. I've seen Planet of the Humans. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'm wondering how to counter misinformation about renewable energy.
Yes, I'm not planning to watch it. There are so many people who have written really good analyses of what's wrong with it. I don't feel a need to add my voice. I'm not surprised. I mean, we do know that the oil and gas industry is one of the most powerful and richest in human history. And so, of course, they're going to use every possible tool they can to damage anything that damages them, just in the same way that General Electric bought up streetcar tracks and tore them out, bought up electric vehicles and destroyed them, because those were technologies that were their rivals, and so they destroyed them. I'm disappointed but not surprised to see this sort of thing happening. There are huge efforts being made to spread misinformation, because there are people who make a lot of money from that misinformation. There's a wonderful book called Merchants of Doubt about this whole campaign. I try to provide accurate information. I try to also pay attention to what people are interested in. Carbon Conversations, I think one of the things they emphasize is be curious about what interests the person you're talking with. Some people, if you just there's a great book called I'm Right and You're an Idiot. If you start a conversation thinking you can force somebody into a different point of view, probably that won't work any more than it would work in your home. But being curious, what have you noticed? What's different? Was it like this when you were young? Is there anything that's worrying you? Is there any information that you'd like? That's usually a better way to have a conversation than telling people they're stupid.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe just a couple more questions. The next one's from Lynn. How do you recommend we connect with First Nations communities to support climate change challenges?
Right. That's a really good question, and it's not one that I am an expert in. I do know that an increasing number of First Nations have renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects. There are some that would be certainly worth supporting. I guess I'm interested in sort of what kind of support you think you could offer, but if you Googled Indigenous renewable energy or Indigenous climate, you will definitely find people who work in that space. And if you contacted them and offer assistance, that would be fine. I know that NAN, the far northern group of communities right now are just in terrible straits, dealing with COVID, and they probably right now really do need just immediate support getting through. But for example, I know someone who is a fish expert. And so one of the things he does for First Nations communities is once a year, he builds a whole self-contained fish raising tank with all the equipment and the instructions, and he ships it to a remote northern community, and online he teaches the people there how to raise fish in their tank so that they have another food source. So he has a skill, and he shares that skill by building a kit and sending it there and teaching them how to use it, which goes back to Maimonides, you can teach someone to do something for themselves. So what's your skill? How can you help? As you know, it's not ideal to phone someone who's in trouble and say, how can I help? It's better than nothing, but it's better if you could say, listen, I can do X, would you like that? So if you have a specific skill to offer, gosh, I would think that some of them at least would be interested. The Six Nations has quite a sophisticated understanding of these issues, and they might have an idea.
We did have an Indigenous speaker in the fall, Lindsay Kretschmer, and she might be a good contact for us to start with. I'm thinking, Lynn, to see if she's got some connections for us to start that engagement. I think this is going to have to be our last question because we're getting close to 9 o'clock. So for you, Lynn, this is a good one about young adults and, the economy and looking forward and getting jobs. How do young adults with no green work experience get jobs in the green economy when green products are not being funded?
Right. I don't have a magic answer to that. I don't know how people get jobs anywhere in the economy right now, and it's probably going to be really brutal going forward. But there are a number of networks. So for young women, they should certainly join Echo Babes. Frances Edmonds has a group which, when we're allowed to, gets together every month or so for women in the green economy to support each other. And there's a Facebook group that you can ask to join. It's really good to get a skill. If you listen to my Green Economy Heroes podcast, you'll see that people come to the green economy from all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences. Depends what you're good at. If you're chemist, if you're a gifted chemist, probably in chemistry. If you're really good at retail, then maybe running a retail store. If you're a wonderful singer, maybe making music on this. But it's just persistence, right? You've got to pay a lot of attention, go to the networks, follow people on LinkedIn, and try to learn something that can be useful, and then offer to be useful. A lot of the green firms are small. They're not going to have a lot of cash flow, especially in the near future. So if you're in a position to do some unpaid work, I know not everybody is, but sometimes that's a way in. But always learn first. Try to add value as quickly as you can. Try to figure out what they might need and see if you can help fulfill that need. Remember, the person you're talking to doesn't have a magic wand either.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. I'll just mention one comment from Brian that Humber College has a green trades.
Oh, great.
Energy retrofitting work, for example. So there are some training possibilities out there, I gather. You've given us a tremendous amount to think about, Dianne. I'm going to turn this over now to Sharon Kuzar, who will
thank you.
With our closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saxe, for a thought-provoking, inspiring, and extremely bold presentation. As Kathy said in her introduction, you've been recognized as one of the world's top 25 environmental lawyers, and it's easy to see why. While we've all been aware that Canada is a major polluter, I'm sure it's still shocking to all of us to be reminded that we're #1 in per capita emissions, higher than the US and China. It still shocks me. And while individual action is important, you've emphasized that collective problems need collective action, and it's our obligation to push government to action. As you know, Dr. Saxe's presentation is being sponsored by the Social Justice Committee of the Danforth Jewish Circle. Occasionally, when I've told people that our Social Justice Committee has a climate action team, I've heard the question, what does climate change have to do with social justice? If you look at Dr. Saxe's website, saxefacts.com, you can read the letter that she and the Climate Caucus of Mayors and Councillors from across Canada are sending or have sent, I'm not sure, to Prime Minister Trudeau. That letter states that when the COVID-19 pandemic passes, we cannot go back to the old normal. The old normal was a global population suffering from gross inequity, exacerbated by decades of failing to take decisive action on climate change. The Climate Caucus emphasizes the need to rebuild our communities into the sustainable, equitable future everyone deserves. This investment in the future needs to be equitable, as those who are most marginalized in our communities are being hardest hit by this pandemic, just as they are by the changing climate. Many climate change policy experts insist that without equality and equity, without peace and security, we cannot effectively fight climate change. Skeptics often contend that the far-reaching climate agenda is far too concerned with extraneous issues such as jobs, infrastructure, housing, healthcare, civil and Indigenous rights. Stick to greenhouse gases, they say. Reforming the energy system is utopian enough. But I think we need to attack on both fronts. The reality is that climate change doesn't affect all of us equally. People in developing countries are more than 20 times as likely to be affected by climate-related disasters as those in the developed world. We also know that lower income communities often have to choose between industrial development and jobs as opposed to their health. Rising temperatures and variable precipitation are likely to decrease the production of staple foods in many of the poorest regions, increasing the prevalence of malnutrition. Dr. Saxe refers to future dire water shortages, and indeed, it is estimated that by 2025, 40% of the world's population will be living in countries experiencing significant water shortages. And so, Dr. Saxe, thank you again for helping to guide us in how we might take collective and audacious action in the area of climate change, and for identifying areas that we can speak up on. And thank you for the great work you continue to do on behalf of the environment. Tonight, we have learned so much from you that our climate action team can integrate into its deliberations. And I think we can assure you that we will be endorsing letters to MPs and councillors and MPPs to sign the Climate Caucus letter. Thank you so much. I just want to address people about if tonight has inspired you to be any more involved in environmental issues and you'd like to be involved with, for example, national groups. One helpful website is goodwork.ca, which is a directory of green and environmental groups, organizations, networks, and associations in Canada. There's a website called BC Sustainable Solutions, which lists a comprehensive Canadian directory for environmental groups. But a simple Google search can reveal a host of both local and provincial organizations that you might wish to join. And of course, we would welcome your involvement in the Social Justice Committee's Climate Action Team. You may contact the team at djcclimateaction@gmail.com. There have been encouraging responses around collaboration on environmental issues with other synagogues. Unfortunately, those have come to a standstill during this pandemic. So please join something, and we would welcome you to join us on the Climate Action Team. Thank you.